Welcome, everybody. Thank you so much for joining us this afternoon. I am very happy to be presenting this fireside chat on Beauty Meets Science, how to create defensible cosmetic claims. I am joined by the lovely Suzanne Mickey, the CEO and co-founder of Citrus Labs, which I've worked with probably for a couple of years now, back and forth, and I'm so happy to have her here on this webinar. So Suzanne, I'll give you a little bit of time to just talk about Citrus Labs and kind of what you guys do.
Yeah, thank you so much, Heather. It's great to be here. Citrus Labs is a full service contract research organization, and we are the leader in decentralized clinical trials for consumer brands, including supplements, functional food and beverages, pet health, as well as cosmetics slash skincare.
Awesome. So now I'm going to give you a really short background on Bustos Law Group, and then we'll dive right in. So to introduce myself, I'm Heather Bustos, managing partner of Bustos Law Group. We're a full service FDA compliance law firm. So we help companies in the food, supplement, medical device, and cosmetic industries all across the supply chain. So everything from manufacturers to distributors, importers, brand owners, so everybody in the supply chain. We, like I said, do full service. So we help with services like label reviews, registrations, GMP audits, and then hopefully this never happens, but if you ever do get into trouble, we help with responding to warning letters, FDA audits, recalls, so a little bit of everything. And we also do some FTC work, which we will be talking about in this presentation in terms of the substantiation side of things. So let's dive right in. And the format of this is going to be very low key. We're just doing a fireside chat, a little back and forth. It's a little different from my normal webinars, which are like very content heavy, but I think it'll be fun. And we've done this before, Suzanne and I, and it's always enjoyable.
Yep.
All right. So the foundation of a defensible claim. So basically, the title of the webinar, like making a defensible claim. And I think, when we're talking about this, and Suzanne and I have had this conversation before, you have to look at it from two angles, right? The FDA side of things, which is like, is it a cosmetic claim, right? Or does it tread into a drug category? And then on the other side of things, on the FTC side of things, how does that substantiation play a role in compliance, right? Like what kind of substantiation do you need in order to make sure that the claim is, again, defensible? So Suzanne, a question I have for you is, what would you say makes a cosmetic claim defensible? And why is it so important that brands think this through before they're launching their product?
So product claims are in itself marketing, right? It's a marketing asset. Brands use it on, websites typically, right, with a product packaging, sometimes even as flyers, add-ons in packaging, for example, specifically, with e-commerce. And consumers are these days more skeptic, right? If something is too good to be true, oftentimes they do believe it's too good to be true. And they're kind of two versions for it, right? What makes something defensible? So first, it's ingredient research, where you actually go after existing research, do a literature review, and then come up with claims around your product, because your product probably has ingredients that have been studied before. So that's just one version to go about it, and then another one is to actually conduct your own clinical study or even a consumer perception study. And from my experience, consumer perception studies are, the preferred tool in the cosmetic field versus clinical trials. Clinical studies are sometimes also used in the cosmetic field, skincare field as well, but they are more used in supplements, or even like beauty from within, for example.
Yeah, which is a growing category. I've seen that so much now at trade shows, is the beauty from within.
Yeah.
Great. That's a really good overview. And I think that goes to like that substantiation side of things, like making sure that you have the substantiation thing. And again, the too good to be true, right? When brands, and we were just talking about this before, like you can't just claim that your product does XYZ. You really need to have that data. And
Exactly.
I think that's a great tip that you gave around starting with literature search, right? Like seeing what's already out there on the ingredients that I'm using, which technically if you're putting together a formulation, you're probably thinking through like I'm putting this ingredient in because it can do XYZ. So I'm
Mm-hmm.
sure that's already part of that development process. But then again, thinking through, okay, what additional layers of substantiation do I need when I'm building that marketing? Because it's usually not as simple as they're just quoting the literature, right? Usually marketing's going way past that.
Yeah.
So what kind of
Yeah.
things you need?
And
Mm-hmm.
then to add to that as well, what I've seen some companies do as well, and you probably are not as happy about that, is that they use the literature making claims, and then they add on to that doing like consumer surveys, right? So they are actually you know sending questionnaires to their own consumers and then making some additional claims based on these consumer surveys. I'm not sure how the FTC is treating that. I do believe that some companies that have done that have received some warning letters either from the FTC or the NAD, but it is something that is out there and that companies are using in their toolkit.
Oh wow. Yeah, I mean, we're gonna, that's an even lower level because I know we're gonna dig into some stuff about consumer perception, which I think,
Mhm.
even though people think of it as like this maybe lower level, right? In terms of like studies, right? It's kind of the lower level. What you're describing is even lower than that. That's like the bottom of the floor, maybe the the basement, in terms of what you're using to substantiate your claims. I probably wouldn't recommend it. But yeah, you would definitely want more data than that, than just those surveys. Okay, so the next topic we're going to dig into is types of cosmetic claims. And I think really this part, I what I wanted to talk about is kind of where that line is drawn between different types of claims. I would say from my perspective as a compliance attorney, I'm always, and more on the FDA side, is I'm always looking at, are you making a claim that's on the cosmetic side of things, or are you going too far over the line? So we've got cosmetic side, drug side, right? And that's usually where brands get into trouble. They eke too far
Mhm.
onto the side of drug claims. And I would say kind of just over that line would be maybe structure function claims, which is an area that people get kind of confused about, right? Is, on the supplement side, you can make a structure function claim. You can talk about how your supplement affects the structure or function of the body. But on the cosmetic side, you can't, right? That's not allowed. That goes over that line. It's not in the cosmetic realm. So I would say, and that's how I'm thinking about cosmetic claims, as an FDA attorney. On your side of things, Suzanne, what would you say? How would you differentiate between kind of subjective claims and objective claims in your testing protocols?
So first, I would like to unpack subjective versus objective claims a little bit as well, because many brands think that objective claims are the ones that resonate most with consumers. What we actually found in our own research is that subjective claims resonate more because it kind of shows them what they can expect, right? If something especially on the supplement side, right? If you did blood work, right, and your vitamin D levels, right, increased by, I don't know, 10%, 15%, 20% over like 4 weeks, 8 weeks, then this is great. This is a fantastic objective result. But how does that translate to how the person actually feels, right? Similar to when you work in the cosmetic field and you have claims around hydration, for example, right? Skin hydration increased by 50%, or wrinkle reduction, by 15%, for example. But what does this mean? Is this actually visible, or is it just measured via an instrument? And this is why I believe consumers feel more drawn to subjective claims that are stating, for example, 90% said their skin looked more luminous, right? Or 90% agreed that their skin looked fresher, things like that. But it's essentially objective versus subjective claims comes down to perception versus clinical trials. So clinical trials are typically going after objective claims, but you can still make subjective claims also from clinical trials. That comes down to semantics, right? How you are phrasing your product claim in the end. But on the other side, these claims from clinical trials, for example, they include instruments. So, for example, if you want to objectively measure wrinkle reduction, or you want to objectively measure hydration, for example, or even like hair, right? Hair growth, for example. I know hair growth is a drug claim. We cannot do that, but some companies are conducting research around that area as well. So then you need instruments to actually measure it, or you need a dermatologist, for example, to do expert skin grading. And this is how you go about subjective versus objective claims. But even though you are going after objective claims in a clinical trial, doesn't mean that you cannot make subjective claims. You can still make them. But if you only go, even in a clinical trial, some clinical trials, they are including all of these instruments, right? And all of these dermatologists to do that expert skin grading. And then in the end, they decide to actually make subjective claims, also because I think from a legal perspective, it is a little bit less risky, right, to make subjective claims versus objective claims.
Yeah. And I like what you're saying about how consumers are more drawn to that. I think we're seeing that as like a trend in general. I don't know if you've heard of this like neurocosmetics trend, where it's like kind of marketing cosmetics to how it feels or the type of mood it gives you. So consumers like have to see themselves in your product, right? And how
Yeah.
it works and how it would affect them. So I think you're hitting the nail on the head in terms of what consumers are looking for. All right. So we're going to talk now about designing a study that holds up. So in this section, I kind of wanted to dig a little bit into the levels of substantiation, which we've talked a little bit about this, the different types of studies that can be done. When it comes to substantiating claims, what do you think are the most important elements of a credible clinical or consumer study?
This is a topic I am very passionate about, because clinical trial study design is, it's very interesting. So when I studied at Harvard, I was able to actually work with the best researchers in the entire world. And one of the classes I took was clinical trial study design. And every study, even though the studies that costs, tens of millions of dollars, they had flaws. And there will be study critique no matter what. So there's unfortunately not that perfect study, because every study has a flaw, every study has a critique. And the issue for me when I think about study design is feasibility. Because my company has to conduct these clinical studies. And actually, that was recently. So one of our clients came to us with a perfectly designed study, and that study was designed by a person who has never run a clinical study, but is an MD at a well-known hospital system. And for some reason, that principal investigator, did not submit the study to the IRB. The IRB is an institutional review board, and every clinical studies have to go through an IRB. And after that study was shared with us, because now they wanted us to conduct the study, it was clear to me that the person did not submit that study because he literally designed the perfect study that no one could execute. The study, minimized the study population to maybe 5 people in the United States due to very strict inclusion-exclusion criteria. Then on top of that, there were some ethical concerns because of a vulnerable population that needed to take a placebo. So that is like all of that, you have to take into consideration when you actually design a study. So this is why, when it comes to like credibility and how does a study design, how a study design should look like, and what level of testing they should include, you will always get critique for your study. There's no way around it, unfortunately. But this is why I believe transparency is so important. So when
Yeah.
you actually present your study results, you shouldn't do what like most brands are doing, where you just put your claims there and then state like based on a third party clinical study. You should state like who conducted the study, um, what were the methodologies, so how did you actually get your data, how did your claims essentially become your claims, how many
Yeah.
participants were in the study, what were like the most important inclusion exclusion criteria. And I think once you have that, it gives you more credibility, because then you are not, hiding anything. And if you want to go on the extra mile, then you can, if it was a clinical study, you can register your study on clinicaltrials.gov. And
Yep.
then your entire study design is laid out on that website, that is based on the NIH database. And then you can link um, your study on your website, for example. And if you want to go even a step further, you can publish your study in an academic journal. And that's even better, because then it typically went through peer review. So a couple of people, typically like 3, 5, sometimes 10 people, were reviewing your study, giving you feedback, and then you have like all of your study critique right there.
Yeah, that's great. And I think we're seeing a lot of brands doing that, right? Like adding the link to the study on their websites. I'm seeing that more and more. And we were just chatting about this, before we jumped on, about how consumers are looking for that, right? They're becoming
Mhm.
more and more educated about, the science behind the products that they're using. And so this is like, I think it's a win-win for brands to include that and be transparent. And I think to your point, the FTC standard is competent and reliable scientific evidence. That's a very vague statement. Like, what does that mean, right? How, what level? And FTC leaves a lot up to the brand to determine, what level of study they need. And then, at the end of the day, as you mentioned, like NAD, which is not a government agency, but just as powerful as one, can come and tear apart your study if they want to, and sometimes it's just out of your control, right?
Yeah, and they again, their every study is flawed,
Yeah.
unfortunately.
Yeah.
Otherwise, you the issue with like these perfectly designed studies is that they are not executable.
Yeah. Yeah. It's true. That's a great point. All right. So next, we're talking about marketing hype to scientific proof. So this is kind of that intersection between, you know, getting the scientific data about your product and then determining how you can market it, right? And that regulatory team working with the marketing, which, don't come to me after you've come up with the marketing. Let's work let's work early in the process. How, Suzanne, how can marketing teams and R&D collaborate to create claims that are scientifically sound and marketable at the same time?
So I think that the biggest issue isn't that there's a gap between marketing and R&D. I think the
Mhm.
biggest issue is the Diane Kruger effect, where there's some knowledge about the topic, but not enough to actually
Yeah.
make like decisions that actually make sense, right?
Yeah.
Especially when we work with teams who have never executed a clinical study, but someone on the team was involved 20 years ago while they did their PhD in a study, right? And now that person is in charge of actually working with us on that study. This is typically when things get complicated.
Yeah.
Because they have like something in mind, but then they don't know how much it will cost, right? Or there's often a disconnect between budget and what they want to achieve, or what 20 years ago was flying high, and you would do a little differently these days. And then there's also a big disconnect between lawyers and brands, which is very funny. And you probably have like a ton of
Yeah.
stories about that, right? But
Yeah.
oftentimes, unfortunately, attorneys are also making studies worse, unfortunately, because we had it several times where attorneys told us how we should think about inclusion exclusion criteria. And you
Mhm.
probably would agree that you have to include like a healthy population in a clinical trial, right?
Right.
But sometimes, because otherwise you are walking a line between like a drug trial um, and a supplement or cosmetic trial, for example.
Right.
But sometimes we have to enroll individuals with some sort of health concerns, because otherwise the clinical trial will not be successful. And our goal is to actually set a study up for success.
Right.
And I think there's sometimes like a disconnect between setting up a study for success and working with all of these different stakeholders, which can be attorneys, can be um, R&D, or can be advisors, like medical advisors.
Yeah, that's true. Yeah, like too many cooks in the kitchen.
Yeah.
Yeah, I agree. All right. Next, we're going to talk about common claim pitfalls. Um, this is something that obviously I deal with. I would say like one of my favorite parts of my job is dealing with claims, helping craft claims,
Mhm.
come up, creative marketing that obviously, doesn't go too far and isn't too risky. And I would say, in terms of some of the most common mistakes you see brands make when developing marketing their product claims, what do you think those are, and how do you think those can be avoided from your side of things?
I think it really comes down to transparency again, right? I think
Yeah.
the most common pitfalls are that they are just very intransparent, um, or even exaggerating their claims a little bit, right?
Yeah.
Um, so often, what I'm seeing, that typically never happens with our clients, because we are very, also thanks to you, we're very strict when it comes to claims and what they can and can't say. But
Yeah.
sometimes when I'm at Sephora and I'm looking at products and I'm looking at claims, and I'm looking what's behind these claims, and then they say it's clinically tested, or or it went through a clinical study, but then I dig deeper and then it was a perception study. This is when I'm like, okay, you should do that, right?
Oh,
And then the other thing that is important, uh, it is somewhat a pitfall, but I also think it's expectation management. So often with cosmetics, we see that cosmetic brands, founders, marketeers, they are disappointed when they get claims that are under 95%, and
oh
that's
yeah, we talked
crazy.
about this. Yeah,
Yeah,
yeah, we
that's
talked about this.
absolutely crazy, right? Um,
Yeah,
and I think it also comes down to that a little bit. And we have been asked like several times to just leave out like that one or two people that did not like the product, right? But this is unfortunately not how it works, and it is very unfortunate. But not everyone on the planet will like your product, or see an effect from your product, right? That's also an interesting thing with drugs, right? Not every drug works for everyone.
Oh yeah, absolutely. One of the things too, at least on the FDA side, so I have to share like my side of things, what I'm seeing, is that issue with brands thinking they can make structure function claims, which I think, obviously when you're dealing with claims, you really do have to understand where those lines are, right? Like, and what a structure function claim is. So I see things like stimulates collagen, repairs skin, as you alluded to, promotes new hair growth. A lot of hair growth products coming on the market,
Yep.
stimulates blood flow, things that deal with kind of things a little deeper than skin deep. But I think it's coming from, at least in my perspective, and I think I read recently like a McKinsey study that was saying, consumers, because of the way the economy is going, everything's more expensive. Consumers
Mhm.
want more bang for their buck, right? They want their cosmetics to do more. And so, would you say that you see that it's kind of pushing brands to make even more claims that kind of push that envelope because they want to get that share, of consumers?
So what I'm seeing is that also brands want more bang for their buck. So
Yeah,
what they want to do in the clinical studies, they want to make claims, yeah, on everything. I like to call it a spray and pray approach, which
yeah,
rarely goes well. If you want to study everything, it's likely that you're not getting results on anything. So rather focus on something that you do extremely well, and then have really good claims on that front. But yeah, I definitely, or we at Citrus Labs, we definitely see that.
that's funny. You just made me think of there's a fast food chain in Texas called Cane's. I don't know if you're familiar with this.
Yep, I am.
All they make is fried chicken fingers. And
Yeah,
when I first went, I'm like, why is there nothing else? That's what they're good at. Just stay in your lane
exactly.
and make that one thing really, really well. And look how successful. So if so do they have it in California now?
I
Then is
don't
it
think
expanded or you've
I
just
don't
visited?
I don't I don't think so, but yeah, I visited Texas. I'm familiar, but I'm also vegetarian, so I wouldn't know.
Well, then maybe they need to make some vegetarian version. I'm
Yeah,
sure they do
maybe
it too.
cauliflower.
Right? Make it so good.
Yeah.
Um, okay, so moving into the next topic, working with research partners. So this has to do with kind of like shaping study design, keeping regulatory involved early, which you know me, Suzanne, like I love coming in early, making sure that, we're setting the track in the right direction, right? That we're not
Yeah.
creating all this data that's unusable, and making sure that the claims at the end of the study are going to be aligned. So if you start off on that right track from the beginning, then I think it kind of pushes things forward. So when I guess the question I have for you is, when a brand uses a lab like Citrus Labs, what does the process look like? Like what are some of the things that brands should prepare before starting a study with you guys?
So I think in general, if you work with us or anyone else, so we actually do have a checklist um, that we might be able to get in front of you. But so first, we preach transparency to brands, and we are actually also advocating for transparency in the research space as well, because research itself is fairly intransparent. It's very intransparent when it comes to pricing, when it comes to timelines, for example. So if the company you're talking to does not display any of their pricing, even if it's just like ballpark pricing on their website, to me that's like a red flag, because it's likely that they have like different pricing for like different tiers of customers or something like that, right? Then another thing that's important is if it's a full service contract research, or if you have to do any part of it. So, for example, Citrus Labs is full service contract research, which means that We handle everything from start to finish, from study design to the medical writing, to recruitment, to logistics, participant recruitment, participant retention, right, data collection, analysis, giving you a report, giving you some claims, some marketing assets as well. So you should make sure that, depending obviously what you want your research partner to do, that they do everything that they want you to do. Then obviously, it comes down to claims. So we like to start at the end. So we like to start with Heather. Heather gives us claims, and we design a study around these claims, right? To actually make these claims defensible, right? How we started this fireside chat. So this is typically how we like to do things. And then, it comes down to obviously marketing, and also what you want to get out of it. Do you want before and after photos that are self-taken? Do you want a photographer to use these before and after photos? Do you want to include instruments, right, to actually measure, make your claims objective? Do you want to have subjective claims? Then if you work with someone who's doing clinical trials decentralized like we do, it's important to have some safeguards. So for example, does the company do identity verification? Because there are a lot of people that are just in studies to get cash. And are these people real people? Is it their primary job to actually be in studies? Do they do their stuff well, right? Do they take the product? Do they apply the product? Do they adhere to the study protocol, right? So does the company have also support to actually support the participants? Then another thing that's very important is data ownership. Does the company you work with give you rights to your own data, right? Do you own your data that you've been paying for the study, for example? Or the other thing is, do you actually have visibility into the study? So for example, we share all of the raw data from day one as it comes in, right? So you will have visibility in your data. It's de-identified, so you don't know who's in the study, but you will see your data regardless. And then another thing is obviously the IRB, the Institutional Review Board. If it's a clinical trial, your study has to go through an IRB. Is that included? Is that not included? If it's not included and they say it's a clinical trial, it is not a clinical trial, because then it also can't be registered on clinicaltrials.gov and you cannot get a publication out of it, for example. And then one very important thing is the research organization, are they using templates, or is it customized? So for example, we customize everything, but I know that a lot of research organizations actually use templates.
Once the brand receives those study results, what are some of the ways that they can interpret and leverage those results in a responsible way? Which I think, we've already kind of touched on, but maybe you could just briefly, talk about any red flags they should look for in the data. I think you've already talked about like expectations around percentages and things like that, but what would you say are some red flags they should look for?
Yeah, so interpreting study results. So from our own research, actually, consumers think that the most believable claims are in the 70%. So it works for most, but it doesn't work for everyone, right? Because as soon as you have claims that are in the high 90s or even 100%, you're actually telling the consumer that this will work for everyone. So if they're using your product, and often with consumers, the issue is that they think that something works overnight, right? So if they're using a product, they use it for a week, and you have 100% claims, and they are not seeing an effect even after 1 week, it's likely that they will not repurchase your product, because then the expectation from the consumer was just too high, for it to work. So our own research showed that 70%, 75, 78 resonated most actually with participants, and it makes sense, right? It's like 7 out of 10 people, found a good effect. And if a brand says 70 something percent, right, they think it's bad. But then we started actually rephrasing claims and say 7 out of 10, and then brands were like all over it. And yeah, because it's a fantastic result, right? So again, it comes down to semantics and how you actually phrasing your claims. And study results can actually be used in many different ways. So the most obvious is, website, um, product packaging, and social media as well. And I'm seeing that a lot of companies are using claims in their ads as well. But then the less obvious is thought leadership pieces, for example. But the brands that do that have tremendous success with it. Using studies, using study results, even if it's not like a very obvious study to actually create claims, but more like a thought leadership study. Thought leadership studies are very different if you're not making claims, right? If you do thought leadership studies, you can actually create like a very sophisticated study with a lower participant number, because then you're not using that to substantiating any product claims, but you actually want to make a point on how a product can work without tying it to a claim. So that can be extremely powerful as well.
Oh, wow, that's really interesting. That's the first time I've heard of that as a concept, but it sounds like a really interesting way to use data. And like
Yeah,
you said, the bar is a little bit lower. So,
exactly.
oh wow, that's
Yeah.
super interesting. I love that. All right, so we're gonna move on to our favorite consumer perception studies, which I can tell you more recently, I am seeing NAD and FTC hold these studies to a higher standard than I've ever seen before. I don't know if you're seeing the same thing. So obviously we're seeing, a rise in consumer perception testing because it's faster, it's more affordable. Like you said, cosmetic brands tend to use it. When do you think this type of testing is appropriate? And when do brands need to go deeper with clinical data? So when do you think it's appropriate to go deeper than consumer perception?
I think consumer perception can be appropriate at any given time. It depends what you are doing and what you're making with the results. Right?
Good
So
answer.
it all comes down to that. And again, I think it comes down also again to transparency. Um, and I'm not sure what you are seeing, Heather, but I would assume that if you're making claims, subjective claims based on a consumer perception study, and then you actually say that this was based on a consumer perception study, we use questionnaires, we use 20 questions. These were the topics of these questions. We used, I don't know, 40, 50 participants. And these participants, um, had these inclusion exclusion criteria, right? They were women between 35 to 55, with concern around aging skin, for example. And then, claims are around um, the feeling of more hydrated skin, for example. They felt this, they reported that, they agreed that their skin had more glow to it, for example. I think this is a great way to actually use consumer perception and then tie that with a self-taken before and after photos, because then you are actually not um, showing that this was a study. You are, if especially when these photos are self-taken, right? They look self-taken, and you are not making the assumption, like you are not putting the assumption into your own customer that this could have been a clinical trial.
Right. Yeah, that's a good point. Yeah, and I mean even the before and after pictures, you know, they're regulated as well, and I've seen NAD hitting on those too, because I think we're just in an age where, you know, obviously with influencers and things like that, like it's really easy to take those pictures and make it look a certain way, and so I think that that's also being heavily regulated. But at the end of the day, consumer perception studies I think are just going to continue to be used, and I think brands are becoming more and more aware of how they need to be used in the proper way. You know, I'm
Mhm.
seeing less people just make outright subjective claims, and, um, you know, using that data in the right way. Okay, next one is claim trends and innovation. So obviously we've got like clean, natural claims, AI powered, all these things that are coming out, and obviously, you know, there's a lot of like ambiguity around these types of claims. What are some of the trends that you're seeing, Suzanne, from your clients in the cosmetic space, and um, you know, what are some of the things that you're seeing that are dominating other than the ones that I mentioned? Anything that you're seeing trend wise?
Gen Alpha is a big trend. Kids,
Oh, yeah.
beauty products for kids.
Yeah.
That is something. When I think back to when I was a kid, I think I actually just started washing my face when I was like 16.
Yeah, yeah.
Before that, like nothing. Obviously, I use sunscreen in summer typically, but otherwise, I did not use any skincare products whatsoever. But it's a um, big trend right now. And then another thing that we already mentioned at the beginning is beauty from within, right? So bridging the gap between beauty, cosmetic, as well as wellness, so that beauty cosmetic is not seen as something that you apply, right, but something you can also eat, and it's like a whole body experience, even like outside of supplements, and more like, stress reduction in general.
Yeah. I like that. Yeah, I mean, and I do see the the stuff with the kids. You know, it's funny when people ask like, "Oh, what skincare did you use?" The one that I always think of is that apricot scrub that has like the little like beads in it. And I remember just scrubbing. Nowadays, people would think that's crazy. I mean, my sister's an esthetician. She would probably think that's nuts using these like super abrasive, but that's
Mhm.
like, you know, we didn't know any better, right? Even for makeup, like what
Yeah,
makeup do you use? Not much, but
no,
nowadays it's common. Um,
exactly.
yeah, that's actually a really good point. I would say that's definitely a big trend. All right, and then our final topic. I know we're a little over time. So building consumer trust through transparency. How would you say, Suzanne, brands can use data and transparency? We've already been talking about this throughout the whole presentation, but not just for compliance, but to strengthen that confidence and loyalty.
So I think trust is probably the most important thing when building a brand, right? Um,
Yeah.
just uh, be believable in what you are doing. And if you are a small brand, it's okay to actually start small. You do not, as a small brand, you do not have to have the same research budget as, or even the same study design as L'Oreal, for example, right? I
Of
don't think
course.
anyone would expect that. And because we talked about consumer perception studies, and when it's a good, uh, a place and time for a perception study, I think for young brands, this is great. It's a great first step, right? It's a good pilot. And then you can build on that. Um, and I think, when I think about trust, it all comes down to more information. I think everyone just wants more information. They want to know, in that case, they want to know how your claims are actually made, right?
Yeah.
Who you worked with, what the overall study design was, what the methodologies were, how did you get this data? And then I think it's also an overuse of the word clinically proven, right?
Oh yeah.
Um, Clinically tested, clinically proven. And I think, Heather, they are also um, going after clinically proven in particular, right?
Oh, big
Um,
time. Yeah,
yeah.
yeah, absolutely for sure.
Yeah, so I think, overusing these words, similar to when we talked about trends like clean beauty, for example. I think there's a lot of backlash happening with clean beauty because it's just overused. And what does it even mean, clean beauty,
Yeah,
right? Um,
losing its yep.
yeah. And I think it all comes down to just more information and actually being transparent and not just talking about that, we are so transparent, but then you are not saying like where your claims are coming from. Is that from a consumer survey? Like, who is a third party testing lab that you're talking about, right? Can we trust these people? Or was it just like a friend of yours who conducted the study?
Very true. Yeah, I agree. And I would say from like a regulatory perspective, I can scare clients all day with FDA, FTC. I think them realizing that a regulatory snafu could really affect the trust from consumers or their brand reputation is probably way scarier, right?
Yeah.
And obviously dealing with those agencies when they put out, a warning letter that's public, that's going to affect your brand. So I think, you thinking about it from both angles, right, is really important. And it's helpful for me when I'm trying to explain to clients, because I think sometimes they think of regulatory as like insurance. It's like, well, do I really need it? Like, yeah, when you get into that problem, you're gonna wish that you had thought about it. So
Mhm.
sometimes that's helpful in kind of talking clients into it. But at the end of the day, this was an awesome conversation. I really, really appreciate your time. I know we went a little bit over, so I appreciate you coming on. This is my contact information, Suzanne's, if you want to reach out to her, QR code to schedule a consult, or just head to our website if you want to learn more. But thank you all so much for being on today. And we'll be sending out the video to everybody who signed up in case we had any additional issues on LinkedIn. So thank you, everybody. And thank you, Suzanne, for being here.
Yeah, thank you so much for having me.